Yeah.
Okay, I'm just setting up the live. Yes, we are live.
Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends, where you are, and welcome to our another LinkedIn Live. And today's LinkedIn Live is very important because it focuses on flourishing bond between India and the United States in the realms of entrepreneurship and innovation. As we delve into our topic, it's important to recognize the profound impact which Indian entrepreneurs have had on the US business ecosystem. India and US, two of the world's largest democracies and the largest economy, share unique synergy that transcends beyond mere trade and economics. It's a relationship on mutual respect, shared value, and relentless pursuit of innovation. Over the decades, Indian founders have participated in the US technology sector and have created deep impact and penetration both in Silicon Valley and to the Wall Street. Right. And today, when we are talking about in this LinkedIn Live, we are talking about the relationship between India and United States, wherein India is a booming economy now. India has just crossed the very important 4 trillion mark, and now it's marching towards the 5 trillion mark. Very soon, India will be third largest economy. India, US being the largest economy, and there is a huge connect between India and US in terms of how they do business. For instance, when the boom of Indian startups started happening late 90s and early 2000s, and most of the VC fund till today coming from US, and US VC ecosystem contributes a lot in terms of funding the Indian startup where even the growth capital is required. Also, in US being the largest market for SaaS and B2B businesses, for Indian startup being the largest ecosystem for small and medium-sized businesses globally. So Indian founders do go and explore that market in US. So in terms of fundraise, in terms of capturing the local market, in terms of growth, US becomes very important for Indian startup ecosystem and Indian founders. And this LinkedIn Live focuses in terms of the challenges and the structures and also aspects around it when Indian startups go and register in US, Indian founders go and register in US, right? And in the backdrop of some of the changes which has happened, which got brought in by RBI last year in August in terms of how the new structure will be allowed when Indian founders go and register in US. So we will in our LinkedIn Live today, we will cover the kinds of entities, the kind of structures which are there in US. We will also cover in terms of the structures which are possible for Indian founders to register in US from the standpoint of creating a subsidiary in India and also giving ESOPs, and also in terms of other very critical aspects. I've got my dear friend and partner, a very known face in the US startup ecosystem, Saurabh Nathany. He's a lawyer there, and he helps hundreds of startups in setting up in US and do a lot of stuff there. I've also got Somik from my team, from India team, who is an expert on cross-border in RBI FEMA aspects, ODI, and He has helped close to 200 companies in go and set up in Singapore or Dubai or US. So with these two gentlemen, I open the webinar and I hand over to Saurabh. Saurabh, thanks again for coming out. And I know you have joined from US. It's very late in US on Friday evening. So thanks for joining in. And I think today with this LinkedIn Live, the idea of this LinkedIn Live to ensure that we bring in a lot of information, relevant information for Indian founders who have companies in US or who want to set up companies in US, either for fundraising or for local market or for other factors which are important. Over to you, Saurabh, with this.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's been great to be here and discuss about all of the stuff that we plan to discuss about. Uh, the the important aspect of all of this is that India as a country, as a destination jurisdiction, has been very active in the startup ecosystem, and it's created its own space in the ecosystem of startups, which is primarily the reason why we see a lot of cross-border work happening, cross-border presence in the US. A lot of investors in the US are interested in investing in startups in India. And so that is the driving force why a lot of companies want to be in the US or have at least some presence in the US. In addition, of course, the other reasons are, some of the key motivations are, let's say there's an established company in India which has been funded in India by India-based investors. They want to capture the US market as a customer base, in addition to UK or whichever other Western jurisdictions. A lot of times, US customers need to have you need to do business with a certain US entity at the very least. So that's another reason why I've seen a lot of companies require just a basic entity set up over there, just from the perspective of contracting with a US customer. So with that, I think I'll just dive right into the presentation that we've put together, Alok and myself. I'll just do a screen share. Okay, so here we are. This is the presentation. I will just dive right into it. I work with White Summers, Cafe and James. Real quick introduction. It's a US law firm. We're based in California, Portland, Oregon. I'm based in Dallas, Texas. We also have an office in Budapest, Hungary, in Europe. We've seen a lot of activity in the European markets as well. That's just the reason we have a European office. Alok here with us, managing partner of TMG Group. Myself, I'm off counsel and head of India practice at White Summers. Diving into discussions, we'll be touching upon ODI regulations. We'll be touching upon what are the type of entities that typically India-based businesses and or founders can look into and take the benefit of when they're looking at US as a jurisdiction. And thirdly, there's this ESOP structure that we can talk about as well. And finally, we'll just also talk briefly about the pros and cons of these structures. Moving along, just a quick disclaimer. The presentation is just for information purposes, not really legal advice. You should discuss with your matter with your attorney and legal advisors. Diving right in, the US entity structure. The US entity structure, just as a before diving deep into the weeds, getting into the weeds, one thing is how the US entity is held. So the assumption over here that we are taking is, let's say there is an Indian business that is already an existing Indian company. In that situation, we have a situation where we have the founder incorporate the India LLP, and through the India LLP, they hold the shares of the US Inc. It could be an LLC or an Inc., but we'll get into that in the subsequent slides. Now, corporation. Now let's look at the first type of entity in the US, which is a corporation. Corporation is pretty much like a private limited company in India, in the Indian context. So corporation has the same requirements, which is you have to register with a certain Secretary of State. like in the Indian context, we call it ROC. We have SOS over here. The next requirement is you have to obtain a tax ID in the US after having incorporated. The third requirement is you open your bank account. And once you do all these three steps, you're up and running and operational. Now, there are other steps also, which we call as completion of the formation steps. So I'll quickly go over that as well. But I'll also start talking about the advantages of corporation real quick. Advantages of corporation, separate legal entity status. We all know the reason why we create companies is that we can do business under a separate legal entity so that the business can be liable for the general business liabilities and debts and not the founders personally liable. So that's one big reason why we do that. Corporation allows us to have that separate legal entity. That way, no personal liability for the founders. The next one is, again, corporation, just like a private limited company, has to have a board of directors. Anytime you have a board of directors, you have to have board resolutions based on which you take certain actions. Any major impact or any major actions that you take in a corporation, you typically do through a board resolution and board approval, and then shareholders approval as well. Specifically in the context of startups looking to flip over to the US, corporation is a better entity to go with, because anytime that you have a corporation, the general perception of compliance is comparatively higher in comparison to LLCs in the eyes of the investor. At the same time, investors also rely on corporate records of corporation, and the law requires there to be a board and shareholders, two different sets of people, and therefore resolutions following through. And I'll talk about the LLC, the benefits and the pros and cons of it, and it has a certain element of investor diligence and aspect over here, overlap over here. And then the third advantage of the corporation, and this is one of the big advantages, is why venture capital funds and investors like investing in corporations, which is there are significant tax benefits in a corporation. Qualified small business stock is a certain tax code benefit that is extended to corporations. What the code says and what the benefit is really that if a stockholder of a corporation sells their stock after having held it for 5 years or more, and certain other qualifying criteria are met, if all of that is as per the IRS code is met, then basically anytime the shareholder sells their stock, they get to write off up to $10 million of federal capital gains tax at the federal level. So that is one of the biggest benefits of QSBS incorporation.
So Saurabh, just to reiterate this, so you are saying that if the shareholders or the founders or the employees, if they continue to hold their equity for 5 years, then they
Right.
get benefit of capital gain up to 10 million, right?
Right.
So 10 million individually, right?
Individually per shareholder.
Per shareholder. Okay. Okay.
And so every shareholder has to, so there are certain requirements of a shareholder, and then there are certain requirements of a company. The shareholders should have held their stock for at least 5 years. The shareholders should have bought their stock for cash or services and certain other requirements. And then at the company level, then there are certain other requirements as well. The company should not have assets worth $50 million or more at the time of issuance of the stock. And then certain other requirements, such as the company should not have bought back stock more than 5% of the overall overall capital stock of the company. So there are some other requirements as well, but this is just generally most of the startups fall within the bracket of QSBS, and so most of them do tend to be eligible. But of course, we look at every case by case basis and
Got it.
advise the startup
Got
to
it.
not
Got
do the exemption.
it. Got it. Got it. Got it.
Continuing on the entity type, the next entity type is LLC. Same requirement as a corporation. You register with the state, obtain your tax ID, open your bank account, and you're good to go. as far as operability goes of the entity. Advantages of LLC, same advantage as regards the separate legal entity. It has the same protection. Founders are generally not personally liable unless there's a fraud situation. And then the next other advantages are, which may or may not work in a certain situations. The LLC statute actually allows founders and the LLC itself to be managed very loosely and very flexibly. What that means is, just like unlike in a corporation where you can have where you need to have a board of directors who manage the affairs of the company, and then on top of that sit the shareholders, which are the members or the owners of the company. In an LLC context, you can literally have the members manage the whole show, which is to say that you don't have a director's level where you just basically have managing members. And managing members are basically members who are also managers of the company. And so they wear a dual hat of being a shareholder and a director. So you don't have to have a separate layer of directorship like you have in a corporation, or managership like you have in a corporation. So that's the benefit of the LLC. However, the LLC, there are pitfalls, obviously. You don't have the QSBS benefit in the LLC type of entity. That's one. And the biggest one is that the perception of the investors is that, LLCs can be loosely managed and governed, and therefore there may or may not be all sorts of compliances in the LLC. So that's the other thing. So, which is why C-Corp is generally the way to go. Anytime you'll see the VCs investing, they will almost always, well, not almost always, I would say in my experience, they always ask the startup LLC founder to convert into a C-Corp because of these issues, corporate paperwork, QSBS benefit, good corporate governance requirements, all of those. This is just what I just talked about. No QSBS.
Yeah, sort of. I think I have a couple of questions that are coming in from the viewers. In case of LLC, right? When you said about the benefits. Now, for LLC, if you could tell us something about the structure, does it require two partners to form an LLC, or if an Indian corporate house wants to form an LLC down in US, can they do it? Right? So if you could tell something about the structure, that would be helpful to the viewers, is what I get to understand.
Yeah, I can just take this back by a couple of slides, a few slides before.
Sure.
So right over here, the first slide that we discussed, where let's say the promoter is based in India and they want to incorporate a US company. This US Inc. over here, this right here can be an LLC or it could be a corporation, either way. It could either be an LLC or a corporation. So the LLC and corporation, both, any one entity can be selected and both entities can be structured in a way where you have two founders or two shareholders or two members. So it doesn't matter how many members you have or shareholders you have, as long as you select the right entity for your requirement and you file the paperwork with the state.
Got it. And for LLC as well, do we also require an EIN?
Yes. EIN is a tax identification number, which you require to file your corporate taxes. It's like the PAN card or TAN in India.
Got it.
Concluding this portion of the discussion, comparison is that between the LLC and the corporation, clearly the corporation is a clear winner. If the entity is, the objective of the entity is to make it VC backed in the US, because of all of those benefits that we discussed. There's QSBS, there's corporate governance, and then over here on the LLC side, although there is a pass-through taxation, just like a partnership, the entity doesn't pay tax. However, the advantages of a corporation far outweigh the pass-through tax benefit of an LLC if the objective is to make it VC backed, even though
So
there is.
just to understand this pass-through concept in a far detailed manner, so say for example, Indian entity, right, opens a US LLC, right? After your, and it's a Delaware entity, Delaware based LLC. How the tax would happen in terms of pass-through? So will the corporation be, or will the Indian corporate be directly taxed, or how the things will happen? If you could give us a rough example.
My understanding is that the LLC has to elect to be taxed as a partnership. By doing that, what the LLC elects to be is a pass-through tax entity, and I should make a distinction with S Corp. This is not an S Corp situation. It's a partnership situation, because in an S Corp situation, you cannot have foreign shareholders. You cannot have non-US residents or non-US citizens in an LLC that is being taxed as an S Corp. So S Corp typically is put on a C Corp C Corp statutorily registered entity. In the LLC context, there is partnership, but I would certainly defer to a tax expert on this. But I can certainly confirm that the pass-through taxation element is available in a way where the India company becomes the taxpayer, and the US entity can be the the pass-through tax entity. So
Got it,
that
got
is
it.
beneficial for those companies who are looking at having some presence in US, maybe not a VC-backed situation, but generally some presence to have maybe
Sure.
to contract with customers or to do some market research, things like those.
Sure. Got it, got it, got it. Sounds
Continuing, I can actually let you take on this one, which is the earlier structure, talks about the earlier structure and in the Indian context on the FEMA and RBI, and then the challenges, and then followed by what the latest structure currently is.
Right. So, Somik, what I would ask you is to, if you can summarize in terms of what was happening pre-August 2022 in terms of structure, and what we're gonna do now, and then Saurabh can also put in his word in terms of what's happening. I think that there were two very important aspects which we need to focus here in, and the reason why Indian founders do and register in US is number one in terms of raising larger capital, because the ecosystem, VC ecosystem is much larger than in US compared to India. So one of the reason, and the risk capital is easily available in US compared to India still. So Indian founders go and register there and make that as a cap table there, and make India as the subsidiary. The number two reason is if you want to go and access the US market in terms of the local market, US being the largest market for small and medium sized businesses, for SaaS businesses, for B2B businesses. And third is if you want to really create global presence and make US the anchor entity and expand globally into different markets. But with that, the challenges also comes in terms of how an Indian resident, if the Indian founder will continue to stay in India and he's not looking to completely move to US, how do they structure? Because there are some restrictions and there are some guidelines by RBI, how it used to happen pre-August 2022 and now how it is happening. Primarily two aspects which we need to focus. One is the Indian founders still need to create the subsidiary in India of that US entity. And the second is, if most of the Indian founders want their employees who are in India, who are employed with the Indian entity and not the US entity, to also get ESOPs with the US entity, because the value or the funding or the fund infusion is happening at the US level. So if you can give a brief overview, and then Saurav and I can also add to it. Yeah.
sure, sure. Thanks, Alok. So, pre-August 2022, what was happening is that the company that was going to be formed was being formed on the US level to the gift route. So basically, what is gift route? And US corporation C-Corp is being formed by US residents, and then it is gifted to Indian shareholders. Now, and that US entity would have an Indian subsidiary because ESOPs will be given to the employees of the Indian subsidiary, right? However, August 2022, what has happened is that Reserve Bank of India came out with the revised guidelines. Now, what does this guideline say? The guideline says that including of gifting, the gifting is included in the ODI guidelines, which summarizes the fact that if an individual opens a company anywhere in the world, that company cannot have a subsidiary back in India, right? And there is cannot, it's not approval route, so you cannot take an approval and then form a subsidiary. It's just blanket, you cannot do it, right? This was happened after August 2022. Now, what is happening nowadays on a structural basis, and that I and Rope and we have done quite a research, and then we have been forming for individuals. What is happening is that the resident individuals are forming an Indian partnership firm or an Indian company, and it's a very important thing that we have to understand. It's a registered partnership firm, not a normal partnership firm. It has to be registered under registered firms. That registered partnership firms opens a foreign entity, in this case an US entity, and that US entity will then have a subsidiary back in India. The Reserve Bank of India clearly and unambiguously has allowed this structure, wherein you can form this entity if you have a entity, a registered partnership firm, a private limited company back in India. So any startups who are going to raise funds through US-based VCs, what they're doing is that they're forming a registered partnership firm, opening an US entity as a subsidiary of this registered partnership firm, raising capital in registered partnership firm, and then have a subsidiary back in India of the US corporation, right? Now, there are two FDI and ODI guidelines that have been triggering, right, due to this. So any entity who will be forming this has to have this thing included in their compliance guidelines, right? So when the registered partnership firm opens a US entity, then you have to have a ODI compliance undertaken, right? And that when the US corporation has their Indian entity formed, then again an FDI compliance has to be undertaken. These two are very important category in the entire formation of things, because only if you do this, only then the structure is fine, right? Coming to the next slide, in regards to the ESOPs, right? If when we form the ESOP of the entity, the employees will be registered in India, because for most of the reason the employees would require PF, ESI, and all the other labor welfare benefits. It's registered as a subsidiary in India, but the stock options will be given of the US entity, right? So the US entity stock options is being received. Also, in this case, this is very, very important. Once you get the stock options vested and granted, then you have to again do our RBI filings. This RBI filings is triggered after 6 months. So one needs to be very, very categorical during the time of exercise of options. And of course, there are taxation trigger points, which I think Alok can put his perspective. There are perquisites and taxation in regards to when the fact that you can effectively delay the entire tax payment by 5 years, within the time of 5 years that the August 2021 budget has categorically put in. So these are the structures that is there, and of course after this ODI guidelines, this structure has been the way forward for any startups registering in US, having a subsidiary in India, and wanting to raise funds, right? Alok or Saurabh, any inputs on this?
Oh no, thanks, Soumik on this. And Saurav, I would want you to also have your views on this, because from a US perspective, because this change has largely happened, which will impact from an India perspective, right? Because in terms of how we create entity in India and how we get the approval from RBI. But from a US perspective, and also your views in this structure, because you have experience of both operating and helping Indian startups to register and raise capital in US pre this change and now. So what if you can also put your word and summarize this for us, and if you have a different perspective also.
Yeah, certainly. So before the regulations changed in 2022, generally the founders based in India used to get their shares through gifting, the gifting route, and that was what I used to see earlier on. That obviously changed, and now things have been little more regularized, and with the LLP structure that we saw on the other slide. On the stock options specifically, I think nothing has majorly changed as far as the way stock options used to be given earlier out versus now, because even earlier the US entity would directly give stock options to employees of the Indian subsidiary, just like it's being done right now. The major difference, of course, is how the founders are holding those shares and how we are getting addressing the round tripping issue, i.e., through the regulations themselves, which allow you to have a subsidiary drop down subsidiary in India. So certainly a little more paperwork, maybe on the founder side and on the India side, but it creates a lot more clarity for people in India, meaning founders and employees. Founders when they're holding their shares, employees when they're getting ESOPs and employee stock options from the US company.
Got it, got it. And I think this also brings in a lot of clarity, because there was a lot of ambiguity in terms of if you go through a gift route, whether you report to RBI, you don't report to RBI, what will happen at the time of exit, whether, because every AD bank or the bank who would differ or would have different opinion in terms of how they would treat this. So I think with this, lot of clarity has come in. Someone just pinged me on LinkedIn saying that because the new structure, and I think Somik, to you, I think this a new structure wherein why do we need to create this LLP or a private limited company in India to invest into US? I mean, so if you can just uh, throw some light on this. So I can just exactly read what this gentleman is asking. Or a private limited company in India it clearly to invest into US. It clearly says that for corporation or for a entity which we need to create in US, why it is mandatory to have a LLP? Also, do we need to form an Indian private limited as well? In what scenarios do we need to create Indian private limited? So let me just have my views on this. So basically, and this has been asked by Shiva, my friend. So basically, earlier, when Indian founders were creating companies in US through gift route, since gift route was not covered under ODI and LRS, they were directly doing it, and there was no the reporting was required, or there was no compliance which was required to be made to with RBI on this. And gift route was wherein their friends or their relatives or their known people who are staying outside India, who are non-resident, would create that entity and give the shares to them. But what had happened is that post this regulation which came in last year, the RBI clearly said that you can take gift only from your relatives, and also there are compliances to be done when you do that. And the challenge was that if you do that, there was a ambiguity, and there was a challenge always that if you do that, if you do a ODI or LRS, and if you invest into US or for any country, how do you create a subsidiary? Because there was a restriction, because there was a round tripping which was involved, tripping which was involved in terms of doing a subsidiary in India. So round tripping is basically when you send money outside India to create an entity and then again bring money into India as capital or other way, and that's where the round tripping happened, and because of that people were doing gift route. Now this has been cleared by RBI. They said that if you do it through a corporate structure in India, that means that if you create a LLP or a private limited company, and that LLP or a private limited company invest into US, create a company in US or anywhere on this planet, then that company can still have a subsidiary in India, and that will not be treated as round tripping, and that has been clearly being clarified by RBI. And that is number one. This is why now we need to do a LLP or a private limited company from India if you want to have a subsidiary, step down subsidiary. The second part, and then I will move it to Somik and Saurabh to have their views. The second part of this question is, do we need to create LLP and a private limited both? Now, this, I think what he's trying to understand is that because the Indian entity will still be doing a lot of work in terms of back office work, development, employee hiring, blah blah blah. So the answer is yes. There has to be two entity. One entity will invest, and one entity will be the operating entity. Because the operating entity ultimately will become the subsidiary of the US entity, right? So there has to be two entities. Over to Somik and Saurabh on this.
Right, I think you have perfectly summarized Alok, to Shiva's question. I think we need to have a registered partnership firm, LLP, or whatever the Reserve Bank of India guidelines put it as body corporate, and the body corporate is defined either as company or a LLP or a registered partnership firm. Only then you can have a structure that allows you to form an Indian subsidiary. Now, one can argue the fact that if I do not require an Indian subsidiary, right? Because in the last couple of months, I have got clients who have asked this question, and that in case I do not plan to have any sort of structure wherein I have form a Indian subsidiary back in India and give ESOPs to Indian subsidiary, then you do not require an Indian partnership firm or a company or a LLP to be formed, right? However, if you're a startup and you want to raise funds from the Silicon Valley based investors or anywhere investors around the world, you need to have the structure formulated wherein you have a registered partnership firm in India, form a US subsidiary of the registered partnership firm, and that US entity becomes the holding entity of the Indian subsidiary again back in India. Now, one thing we must also understand is that in the structures, the entire IP will be belonging to the US entity, right? Because the investors will be investing in the US entity, so the IPs will rest in the US entity, and certain agreements has to be formulated among the three entities, that is the partnership firm, the US entity, and the step down Indian subsidiary, so that the IP that are generated rest in the US entity.
Perfect. Saurabh, over to you, Saurabh.
Right. Just concluding on the ESOPs, the other way that I've seen ESOPs being given is that it's the exact opposite of what we are discussing, where let's say there's an Indian company that's been established for several years and they've been funded in India. They want to open up a US subsidiary for the purpose of capturing the customers and market of the US or market research and whatnot. At that point, I've seen, and this is probably like 1 or 2 out of 10, probably not even two, probably 1 out of 10, where the US subsidiary has employees, and now those employees of the US subsidiary are being issued or granted stock options from the India company. So that is a totally opposite situation, but that's one of the rarer ones. But just putting it out there that that's something that has happened. Sometimes it happens depending on the business case. Moving on to the next summary slide. This is a slide where I
So
like to talk.
Saurabh. So I have a quick point on this. So you were talking about the reverse situation wherein the Indian holding company will have subsidiary in US, and the Indian holding company will give ESOPs to its employees, who are employed with the US entity and based out of US, right? In that scenario, are there any specific compliance or rules relating to ESOPs which they need to comply with in US, or it's only the income tax part or the tax part they need to pay tax and move ahead?
As far as the US subsidiary goes, the US subsidiary is not issuing shares to the employees. So as far as the securities laws go, from the US subsidiary standpoint, there isn't any securities being issued to the employees. However, securities are still being issued to US employees. Therefore, securities regulations generally need to be complied with by the group, by the Indian company. And they usually are, compliant with, as long as they make those tax filings whenever there are, those tax events, whenever there's an exercise. That's a standard, ordinary income, if it's not been paid for cash, if it's for services. And whenever they sell their shares, then there's a capital gains tax event at the hands of the employees. So the standard regular compliances are required, at the US level, but they individually impact the employees more than the US subsidiary.
Got it. Got it. Thanks.
This is the stock option of plan of the India company, which is why it has little to do with the US company.
Got it. Got it. Got it.
So yeah, any
A
other
quick question, sort of, again,
Yeah.
that I've got from one of our clients, and this question is very important because for the last 6 months, this question has been again asked from time and again to me. Is that in the structure where there are two Indian entities, right? This has been one entity being formed just to invest in the US entity, right? And again, a subsidiary that is formed to give the ESOPs and to capture the Indian market. Now, the thing is, what the question that has been asked is, how is the USBC taking this structure into their scheme of things, right? Because over here, they are because still now the US capable look, the Indian founders' name are there, right? Now the Indian founders' name are not there, but a registered partnership firm or LLC's name to be there instead of the founders, right? Now, how are the US-based VCs taking this into their perspective? Because a lot of founders here in India are worried because their name are not coming in the US cap table. Their entity's name are coming, right? And hence there is a sort of a question, especially when there is a founder vesting, right, or the founder leaving. So if one of the founders are leaving, then there is a issue in the US based partnership firm. How are these things are being taken care of is what a generic question that are asked to me time and again, and this time to got a message right now while we were
Let's
discussing.
take, there are a few moving parts in this question. Let's take it one piece at a time. Let's talk about founder vesting. Founder vesting is a contractual provision that is put in a founder stock purchase agreement, whereby the founders agree to put their stock subject to vesting. And the vesting is basically a time-based vesting, which is a vesting schedule. As time passes, the founders vest in those shares. Now, that can also be put on an LLP in case of an India-based founder. So there isn't any issue in the India-based founders LLP buying the shares of the US company and those shares being subject to vesting. It's the same, it's a very similar situation as if the founders individually buying it. From the US company standpoint, they're just issuing the shares, and those shares are subject to vesting. 83B election probably is something that may or may not impact or be of much relevance, because India-based founders are based in India. Unless they move to the US, 83B elections will not really be a benefit to them. Just touching upon it because sometimes these questions come up. that what if, we don't file the 83B and all of that. Other than that, the other question you asked was, what if the founders leave the company and go? Let's say there are two co-founders, both are based in India, founder A, founder B. Founder A, let's say the founder leaves the company and goes, the share purchase agreement or the founder stock purchase agreement usually has the provision where it says that the founder, whichever is leaving the company and going, their stock stops vesting. And the moment the stock stops vesting, they're no longer going to be getting any more shares from the company. So then there are a certain portion of unvested shares and certain portion of vested shares. Vested shares remain the property of the outgoing founder. Unvested shares come back to the company based on the founder agreements. They usually contain clauses that say that if there are unvested shares, company has a right to buy back the shares. So the US company buys back the unvested shares from the outgoing founder. And I think the one other question that you had was, how do VCs perceive this to be? I don't see any major challenge why a VC would have an issue or a problem, as long as the company's founders are holding the shares either through their LLPs or directly. I wouldn't imagine VCs having an issue with the manner in which founders hold the shares. But I could be wrong. Maybe some VCs look at it differently. But again,
Right.
I can't
So the
speculate for any.
second question that was there was the fact that in case of founder vesting, right, the founders are opening Indian registered partnership firm, right? Say example, two founders are opening the Indian partnership firm, 50%, 50% each. Now they form a US entity, they raise capital, and things go smooth. After a particular time, one of the founders wants to move out. Right now, the founder vesting clause in the US entities on the registered partnership form. So, is it better to form two partnership firms? Right. So, founder A forms a partnership firm with, say, his wife or anyone from his family. The second founder forms a partnership firm with his or his family, uh, and and then if say for example if someone wants to even leave, then the second founder's partnership firm may get the vesting thing sorted, right? Is it better to have two partnership firms rather than creating one? Is
Yeah.
what particular?
The answer lies in the question itself, obviously, that in a situation where one founder leaves the company and goes, in that situation, it's better to, in order to address that kind of a situation, it is better for founder A, founder B to have two separate LLPs, LLP A and LLP B. They hold the shares of the US company. Because that's exactly right. That's a situation that can come up realistically, it's a possible scenario where founder A leaves the company and goes, but they both have created only one LLP that's holding the shares of the US company. And now how do you decide on how to divide the shareholding and the outgoing founder and his vesting or unvested stock? So for that, in order to address that issue, you definitely should have two separate LLPs for the two founders.
Got it. This I think is answers the questioner's yeah.
We can move ahead. Yeah, Saurabh.
Yeah. Okay. So then this other slide is something that I have put together, and this is something that I frequently advise founders on whenever I see these. And these are certain things top three things that every founder or startup company should consider when they are forming their company. One is stock ownership. Actually, I just put out a post this morning on this about the top three things that founders miss or companies sometimes don't do is stock ownership. So sometimes what happens is we see companies that have not issued founder stock to them. Now, in India, it's different because in India, when you are incorporating your company with the ROC, right then and there, at that moment, you have to actually declare who the members of the private limited company are, who are the members who are subscribing to the memorandum and association of the company. which is basically the founder stock. In another way, you can call it founder stock. In the US, you can incorporate a company, and at that moment, you don't have to declare who the shareholders are. And you can basically technically incorporate a company and not potentially not have shareholders for a little while. And that's a dangerous way, obviously, that's not a recommended position to be in, because if there's a founder dispute, then the two founders go sideways and they part ways, and then the question is who owns the company and the assets. So that's why stock ownership should always, whenever any startup founder is starting a company, make sure the stock is issued to the founders. And this is a little more important in the US side. On the India side, you have to declare the subscribers to the memorandum at the time of incorporation. Next is IP assignment. I am sometimes surprised to see that founders have started their startup company and they have not assigned their intellectual property. Now, intellectual property generally in the startup parlance is referred to as any business information. It includes, of course, the technology if that's been created, but if not, then even as basic as a customer's list, pricing formulas, and business plans, things like those that are business confidential information, trade secrets, things like those. All of those should be assigned by the founder to the company, because the value is being created in the company, and that's why investors invest in the company. And that's why they don't put money in the individual bank accounts of the founders. They're putting the money in the bank accounts of the company. That's where the value has been created. So IP assignment, founders, please always assign your IP to the company. That's where it should lie, and that's where it should stay. And the third is director and officer election. This also is somewhat important, certainly in terms of importance. Stock ownership and IP hold precedence, because directors and officers, the way the hierarchy is in corporations, in the US corporations, is shareholders hire and fire directors, directors hire and fire officers. So director and officer election also is important, because they have certain powers by statute, by law. Although stock ownership should be the most critical, and the IP assignment in parallel. Yeah, that's mostly covers up and rounds up
I think,
our discussion.
Saurabh, these 3 points are super critical, and thanks for bringing this out. And I think that many people, many of the founders, they just go and create the company and then don't do anything after that. I have seen in some of the DDs which we have done or helped startups to raise capital, even after 3, 4, 5 years, we have seen that stock ownership has not been done or IP assignment has not been done. And because of that, either there is a rejection in the DD, or the fund infusion takes months, because these processes do take time. And then if you are doing it at a delayed time, there are also other challenges which comes in. So thanks for bringing this out. uh, I think with this, we kind of complete what we want to cover. There are a lot of queries which are coming in on LinkedIn, but what we will do, Saurav, is that we will collate everything, and then we can do a Q&A sometime. And what I understand with kind of interest which we have got is that we have to do maybe one LinkedIn live every quarter, and on specific points, which for example, what to do once you have incorporated the company. I mean, we have to go deep in terms of stock ownership, IP assignment, and directors and officers election. So those are interesting aspects. Thanks, Somik. Also thanks, Dipanjali, for setting it up, and again thanks,
Hello, and sort of just a quick question, because this
Saurabh.
question, yeah.
Somik will keep asking. Yes, Somik.
Yeah, so sorry, because this question has been asked at least 4 times to me in WhatsApp right now. So I need to ask sort of if he may just elaborate a bit more
I
on
had a
stock
mug of coffee,
ownership.
so I'm awake.
Yeah. on the stock ownership part. Especially, the question is that usually, at least in India and Singapore, what happens is when they incorporate from that day itself, they become the owner of the stocks. Now you say that's not the case probably in US, right? So
US.
if you could be a bit more specific on this, how the things are done in US, that would be helpful to the viewers, especially on the stock ownership part.
Sure. So the steps of incorporating a company in the US are as such. There is a certificate of incorporation in the US, which is the main certificate of which is the main registration certificate. In that certificate of incorporation, as per Delaware law, you need to mention your authorized stock, which is in terms of number of shares. In the Indian context, it's in terms of the amount of share capital in Indian rupees. In the US, it is in it is in the context of number of shares. You mentioned the number of shares, you mentioned the company's name, you mentioned certain other things in your certificate of incorporation. Par value, which is somewhat less analogous to face value, um, and then the name and address of the incorporator. So at that point, there is this person called incorporator, quote unquote, who is incorporating the company. The job of the incorporator is only to incorporate the company, not to elect, not to declare who the shareholders are, because the incorporator doesn't have that authority. So under law, there is actually a person called incorporator whose job is just to incorporate the company, hand over the company to the directors. Meaning, once the certificate of incorporation has been filed with Delaware, usually the next step is the incorporator puts a resolution saying, this is the person who is being elected as a director, and I, as incorporator, am resigning. That's it. Once that happens, the company now is in the hands of the director. The next step after that is directors then get up and issue the shares and approve, rather, through board resolutions, they approve the issuance of shares, they approve the issuance or rather election of directors' officers, which means CEO, CFO, president, secretary, adoption of the employee stock option plan, things like those. So it's the directors that take that step once the company has been incorporated. So at the COI filing stage, there is no such even place to mention the shareholders, and
Okay.
nor is that a requirement under Delaware law.
Got it. Got it. Got it. Got it.
Which is why sometimes you can have technically a situation where directors have not passed resolutions for issuing shares. They've only taken the company from the incorporator, and now they've maybe elected the officers, but they haven't done anything to do with share issuance. And I've also seen a situation where for 2-3 years, there's been no share issuance in the company. It's just directors and officers running the company, which is not the best situation to be in, because yeah, if a founder disputes happen, then things can go bad.
Perfect. So thanks, Saurabh, for that. So we will not ask more questions because it's very late in US now. We'll let Saurabh go. Thanks, Saurabh, for this. And it's been very, very good, very informative. And as I said that since considering a lot of interest, we have to do it regularly. So we'll come back soon. Thanks everyone for joining in.
Yes.
If you have anything on US, India structure, setup, do contact us and we will be more than happy to help you. As I said, Saurabh works with a lot of startups in US, and we've been doing this for 2 decades now. And we as a firm group, we work together and do a lot of stuff for startups, from unicorns to emerging companies to SaaS companies to B2B companies. So feel free to contact us. Thanks, Somik, also. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a good weekend. Enjoy your time with family, and we will meet soon. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Take care. Bye.